Thanks for tuning in. This is performance psychologist Fiona Murden, and you're listening to the Dot to Dot podcast. Our purpose? To explore the rich insights that personal narratives bring, speaking to subject matter experts through to people sharing their own life stories. And while you're listening, I encourage you to find potential seeds of wisdom that could breathe new life into your current endeavours. And in the coming weeks, we'll be sharing some news about a massively exciting platform that we've spent the last year and a half developing. If you're listening after October 2023, it's already out there. But for now, sit back, relax, walk, run, drive, or do whatever you do when you're tuning in. Today, I am very happy to welcome Sebastian Kurten to, and have I said your surname correctly there?
Yes.
I have. All right. That's something to celebrate. I'm not always very good at pronouncing things. Sebastian Kurten, tell us a little bit more about you. Who are you? What do you do at the moment? And then maybe we could talk a little bit more about what led you to do this.
Yes, thank you for introducing me. My name is Sebastian. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge at the medical school at the Cognition and Brain Science Unit. And what my main field of research is at the moment, we investigate the effects that social media has on adolescent well-being. And to do so, we run like a lot of different studies. We look at adolescents in multiple countries. We look at adolescents with multiple backgrounds. And what really interests me is, for example, how adolescents in different societies, for example, from countries in Southeast Asia or in Africa, or adolescents growing up, in deprived families in the UK, how their well-being is associated with social media use, and what are the differences in the different subgroups of adolescents.
And from a sort of a more academic perspective, what I'm thrilled to hear you say there is you are looking at populations other than just the UK or Europe. It's taking it further afield because there are massive differences. And we have had a history in psychology of focusing a lot of our research on to America and Europe and maybe Australasia. And so that's fantastic that you're looking at different demographics and different populations.
Yeah, so what kind of draw my attention to that? So before I joined academia, I was working as a social worker. So I'm trained by training. I'm like a social worker and a statistician, and so I worked a lot with in public child protection. And what really sparked my interest there is that when you work with adolescents, and you realize that adolescents grow up in a lot of different life realities, and some of them have more chances than others. Then that really sparked my interest in what are like specific risks, for example, associated with growing up in specific settings. And what I find interesting about it, that it's also sometimes not so much about like the individual differences or something, but it's more about like, okay, what about societal context? So as a product of a specific societal context that you grow up in, what does that then do to how you see life, how you grow up and everything.
And again, I'm thrilled to hear that, because as an organizational occupational psychologist, we are very conscious of context and looking at things within the bigger context. But again, with research, I think aside from social psychology, there can be a tendency to look at individuals in isolation of their context, which doesn't make sense, because we're completely interconnected with the people around us in particular. And I mean, I'm massively interested in that from a personal perspective, because the second book I wrote was about some of the neuroscience behind social learning. So I could geek out for hours on this, but let's talk more about you. So I didn't realize that you had been a social worker. Was that your sort of first career calling, as it were? Did you train? Where did you grow up, and how did it lead you to have an interest in those things and pursue them as a career?
Yeah, so I grew up in Germany, basically, where I spent where I used to work for like a short time as a social worker. So I grew up in Cologne. I studied social work there at like a small university for 5 years. I worked half a year in child protection. I worked in educational things, like some like science communication. And so my main focus was on child protection, and this is where I started first as like a research assistant, working on research project investigating stress and well-being among staff in social work, because that was something doing working as a social worker. What really came to my attention, I think like a lot of people always complain about their jobs, but it became apparent that there's maybe some more substance to these complaints than maybe with other people. This was like my first kind of my first career, but I only worked in this field for like a year before I switched to research.
I mean, it's a tough environment. Being a social worker, I think you can feel, and this is me hypothesizing and asking questions as much as anything, is disempowered by the environment, because you just want to help these families, and there aren't always ways to help. And so I'm guessing, did that lead you to the sort of the curiosity of wanting to understand more about some of the mechanisms that enable or?
Yes, exactly. The unique kind of challenge I think that you have in this field, you basically have two demands. You want to help, but you also need to control in a sense, and that makes working in these fields quite difficult. So, for example, you can have like how it is organized in Germany basically means your primary purpose is to help, and for example, parents, they reach out and they ask for help, and then you get a mandate to help them, and only in a small proportion of cases you are demanded to kind of protect and to control, in a sense, when like a well-being of children is at severe risk. And this is also what puts a high strain, or what can put a high strain on workers, because if you're in an occupation, for example, where you would only help, then it's way easier, for example, to get rewarded for that. But if you have this control demand, it can be quite challenging. Like an example would be, so for example, one situation that would encounter quite often is it would be in the afternoon. You basically almost finished a whole work day, and then you come into a situation when there's some crisis in a family, and you need to take a child to another place, or you need to get active, or for example, you need to take a child out of the family, and that would be at the very end of your work day. You've already worked like for 8 hours, and this is then kind of like still coming up, and naturally you're exhausted, and then you need to deal with a challenging situation. And it's not like it would be a situation, for example, where the parents would be very happy to see you. It's like, oh, you made it after a long work day. So nice. Please take our children, or like find a solution. So this is what can make it challenging, because it can be, there can be an absence of rewards in a sense, basically.
And did that lead you to do the research that you did on the impact of transformational leadership on perceived effort reward imbalance among social workers?
Yes, exactly. So what our idea was then to find a model to explain that and identify mechanisms that could help social workers in this situation to do their job better. So a model that is used in various fields to describe that thing is the effort reward imbalance model, which basically assumes that you have certain a job, for example, comes with certain efforts and rewards of different kinds, and that there always need to be a balance of a sort. So a very easy example would be if you need to work a lot of hours, if you need to make over hours, and for example, then if your payment would be very high, you get some kind of reward for it. And even though you need to work a lot, you can also then do a fancy vacation once per year, 2 weeks, because you have all that money, and that could then kind of offset these efforts. But these efforts and rewards can also come in different forms. So it can be emotionally challenging, what I think is a very strong motive in social work, because you're working with people in very challenging situations, and this puts on the social work a lot of like emotional strains, and and therefore it is very important that there are rewards basically, but we also saw that these rewards are kind of in risk because the payment is not exceptionally high. It is it is very difficult because you also are in this protective setting, so you have to follow a lot of like objective rules. It is a very kind of standardized process, which can make it additionally challenging.
It takes away your autonomy, doesn't it? And I think we know that autonomy has a hugely positive impact on people's emotional health in the work environment.
Yes, exactly. The autonomy, or like agency, different perspectives of looking at this construct. That basically is a thing that can improve your well-being, because it gives you the feeling of being in control, and this this feeling of not being in control is something that can that can challenge you. And this is also where transformational leadership kind of comes into play, because the idea of transformational leadership is basically that you perceive your employees, or you give you, as a leader of a work group or of a team, you give your employees the resources that they need to kind of transform themselves to perform their job well. So as a transformational leader, you would ask basically, or you would ask yourself or ask your employee, okay, what can I do to help you succeeding in your job, or what kind of resources do you need in succeeding in your job? How can I provide them? How can I help you in doing that, basically?
And that feels like a very fundamental human need to feel supported by the person that is in effect controlling you, which is a further level of disempowerment. But then if you've got someone like that in that transformational leadership, taking that stance of transformational leadership, it provides comfort, empowerment, motivation. It gives back some of that agency you were talking about, helps people navigate the environment they're in, and provides, I mean, the thing that's probably hardest and most important is the emotional support.
Yes, exactly. It's what you say. It's the paradigm or the idea of supporting that is very important in these social work settings from a leadership perspective. I think what is still kind of a lot of it's still quite dominant in a lot of like the leadership ideas, or like or how leadership is done in a lot of institutions, is the idea of control, that like a leader or a boss, so to say, is supposed to control its employees. But this idea or this paradigm, it hits borders if you work in very challenging situations with people, for example, or like when you so take the daily work as a social worker. You have to deal with very complex situations, and so you assume that everyone is trained really well and they're experts in dealing with these situations. So it will be very difficult for a leader to control someone in this situation, because there's so much information, and the person making this decision in the moment is seen as the expert, because it is a very complex decision. So the idea of controlling, saying people how they should behave in certain situations is very difficult, because every situation is very unique if you work with people, basically. And this is why supporting employees is seen as rather effective compared to like controlling employees. It also has to do a lot with trust, and how trust is also like a very basic human need. And if you feel that, you know, your leaders or your colleagues trust you, then you feel much more empowered to perform a certain job, basically.
And trust is, I mean, it's fundamental, isn't it? When I work with leadership teams, with the aim of becoming high-performing teams, the foundation always has to be trust. If trust isn't there, then you can almost just not bother, because it has to underpin every effective relationship. But again, when you're talking about the complexity and the strain and the pressure that social workers are under, all these things, the volume is turned up on them. So like you describe in different organizations, of course, the same sort of thing applies and it matters. But when you're in such a high pressure environment, the volume is really turned up. And so you see the levers play out a lot more before your eyes, or you're able to do great research like you did.
Yes, exactly. I think pressure is a oh, sorry.
It's fine.
Yeah, I think what you said, like that trust is a foundation of good working teams. I think that is also key here, because control is something that can undermine trust, basically. And if you and the pressure is always high on these people, because there's also a mechanism at play, is basically because the pressure on these teams is so high and the work is challenging. A lot of people leave, and then you have less people, and the people that kind of remain even have to deal with the situation. And yeah, it is really challenging at the moment, these working fields. So that's also
sorry.
No, that's also what we saw in our research, that there's a positive influence on of transformational leadership on this behavior. I mean, what we basically did, we asked 200, a bit less than, I think it's 180 or 200 social workers from very different child protection, like the public child protection services in Germany. And we asked them about their experiences and how they perceive leadership behavior. And indeed, we found that this, like, there's some data to it, that this supports their well-being and their feeling of autonomy.
And you can see exactly the same in the NHS, where you have nurses who are under, and doctors, but nurses under huge level of strain. The pressure can often lead someone, a manager or a leader of the group, to act in a non-transformational way, which then increases the impact, the negative impacts on the people within that team, undermines trust, creates a vicious cycle, because then you have people leaving, puts more pressure on the people that are already there. The boss gets more stressed. The boss returns to more of a command and control way of operating. And here we go again.
Yeah, that's exactly a mechanism. The models that we use, like transformation leadership, effort reward imbalance, that is something that originated exactly in research on occupational health in health service workers, because that is indeed another field that is very closely related, with very similar mechanisms, and the vicious circles that you described, that is that is a thing you can get easily into in these working environments. Another issue that we encountered was that people who described that they were that were struggling a lot with their well-being, with their work-related well-being, was that they also were very highly committed. Like we could say they were over committed to some extent, and that put additional strain to them because overcommitment kind of makes you lose a bit the ability to recharge yourself and take like a critical distance. So we could even go so far and say that overcommitment is kind of a losing game for your mental health in the workplace.
Well, I think particularly when it's something that's so vocational, because you're doing this not for the money. You're not doing it because you're going to have a luxury, car at the end of it, or your fancy holidays or anything like that. You're doing it because you care and you want to make a difference. It's interesting as well, the research within doctors and nurses, this piece of research specifically doctors, but it's been repeated globally that burnout increases as levels of empathy increase. So you see, the more caring someone is, the more they care, the more they will burn out. Although that there's an interesting, there is also counter research saying that burnout results from people who have lower empathy. So I think there's a lot to unpick and to understand that we don't really know the details on yet. And that's what I love about our field with psychology and brain sciences. And there's still a lot to learn, and it's so complex. And so that is massively interesting. It's something that I'm really passionate about. I've never worked with social workers. I have worked with doctors and nurses and find them massively. I feel like they are just angels, the work that they do and how they do it. And it's the same that's true of social workers, because they put themselves in positions of physical and emotional risk the whole time for the sake of looking after others. And so what led you from that, where obviously you were dealing with children, you were dealing with situations where you were seeing not nice environments, and you wanted to try and understand that more. You've ended up in the UK, so just in terms of you, and now very much focused on that research around children, or teenagers in particular, adolescents, and how they respond to social media.
Yes, so it was basically a bit of the idea to kind of shift from the very practical side of you to take more of like a bird's view on things, and to look at it from a research perspective. It was mainly the idea of taking another perspective on the same thing. So what I basically did afterwards, I stopped working as a social worker, and then I studied statistics and did a PhD in social science, and then afterwards I came to the UK to work on one project together, with my colleagues Amy Orban and Sakshi Guy, who are like wonderful colleagues on this project. What we basically do, we work together with UNICEF on a big study that's called Disrupting Harms. And the main idea of the study is to look at online related abuse of adolescents in different countries, specifically in the global south. So we have the data from Africa and Southeast Asia. And what motivated me to do this switch is that you have the possibilities of doing these studies and then investigating in a very large scale what are risk factors for adolescent well-being, and how can we identify ways of improving adolescent mental health and adolescent well-being. And it's the idea that we're working on this really hard because we have the idea that we can really make an impact by doing that well, and producing a thoroughly researched study. And that was my motivation to come to the UK, basically.
So there's a drive to want things to improve, to find out how you can be part of making that happen at scale.
Exactly at scale, and because I think it's so relevant at the moment. I was even surprised. I don't know whether you've watched the Champions League final like this week.
No, I'm sorry. I probably should have done, but no, I didn't.
And they have they even, the UEFA, they always have these campaigns against racism and awareness for certain things. And they had a campaign thing was against online abuse or like online related abuse of young women. And I thought that was quite interesting because that was exactly what we are researching, and it is now, I feel it is now coming in more in the public sphere. Another example why it became so relevant was like this during the last year, a couple of months ago, when Elon Musk bought Twitter, was basically a lot of layoff in teams in different countries, for example, in the Philippines, and these teams were mainly busy with content moderation or like investigating harmful content. And so what we basically see is, or the main problem, I think, is we have a lot of social, like we have billions of people using social media, and we don't really know how many children are victims of online related abuse on different platforms, on different channels. And we don't really, we don't know how many are victims, and we also don't know how many we can, or how we can protect them from it, or how we can improve this situation. And this is basically what we want to investigate. And so, this is why we think that this is very relevant at the moment.
It's huge. It's hugely relevant. It's hugely important. I have a teenage daughter myself, and I have another daughter who's 10, so about to become a teenager. And there's an elusiveness about what happens online. Like, even when you can look over their shoulder, it's different from when I was growing up, when my parent could come into the room and see what was on television. Or pick up the book that you're reading and look at the cover. But with online, it's so pervasive, and yet so easy to hide it from people who could protect or want to protect that teenager.
Yes. That's true. I think the research, how it was characterized the last couple of years, it was very much about us in Western societies, basically, a couple of years as researchers collectively trying to figure out a bit. Okay, the common observation was all our children are on social media. Is that bad? Is that bad for the children? What does it
what does it do?
What does it do to them? And then we spent a couple of years of researching. I think it's fair to say now that there are like maybe like small negative links between media use and well-being among adolescents. We can talk about that more later.
Yeah, I'd love to.
But what I think is, what we still don't know is that it's a very Western perspective. We don't know what does social media do to adolescents in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yep.
Who grow up on a very different, in a very different context with very different possibilities. And so I think now, after we figured out kind of our Western perspective of things, it's maybe time to like think about it globally and see, okay, what do we need to do on a larger scale to deal with social media, or how to improve it for adolescents.
Absolutely. And I think it's more important than ever to have that global view, because all social media is accessible. I mean, I know there are some blocks in certain countries, but globally. And so it's really important to know how one piece of content has a different effect on different individuals in different environments and different cultures. So the data you have, was it one of the first studies where it was looking at the alcohol use?
What I was talking about now, there was a study where we look at media use and the prevalence of media-related abuse in different countries, like research on media use and substance use. There were studies we conducted in Belgium that was basically 1 and 2 years ago. This is also why I said, okay, I think this is what we did like the last couple of years, figure out the European West,
yeah,
and now the next is we need to move on and kind of look at it on
the rest of the world.
on the rest of the world, basically. Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, I've read all sorts of different research, and I think there's some research that says social media doesn't have an impact, and there's some research that says social media does have an impact. Some that says if a child already has a propensity towards anxiety and depression, then it's more likely to exacerbate that, which actually makes sense when you start looking at some of the mechanisms. But it's all a bit vague still, isn't it? A lot of the research. Vague's probably not the right word, but you know where I'm going with it.
So I definitely I would maybe replace the word vague with like layered. They're very.
That's a much better word.
Yeah, like with research, it very much depends on the perspective. How I would, from my perspective, sum up the current evidence on media use and well-being, mental health of adolescents, that on average, I'm saying like on a general level, I think that we see evidence for like a small negative link of social media use and well-being, but also like a small negative link with, for example, what you mentioned before, like risk behavior, like alcohol consumption or like other risk behavior. I think that doesn't mean that you should be worried if your child is on social media. But what I think is to, as an addition to this claim that there are small negative associations, are like three major things, or three things I think to keep in mind. For me, the first thing is like probably on a general level, social media doesn't do massive harm to mental health in general, but it is probably also not a super beneficial thing on the average level. So if it always depends on what is the alternative. If you're like just sitting at home for an hour, don't have anything to do, if you're then on social media, or like if an adolescent then on social media, that won't probably do massive harm. But if you prefer to stay on social media instead of being outside with friends or doing other activities which could be better for your which could actively improve mental health or well-being, then there's kind of opportunity costs for being off social media. And I think a second thing that is really important is child's vulnerability, basically. So in different subgroups, different content, for example, can be indeed very harmful. So for example, one study that my group did under the lead of Amy Orban was to basically show that there are certain windows of sensitivity during which children are vulnerable to negative effects of social media use. And what they identified basically that you have these vulnerabilities during the onset of puberty. So I think it's about 13, 14 for girls and 1 or 2 years later for boys. And the mechanism that we hypothesize basically is that social media is a medium where comparisons are increased because you're constantly confronted with, okay, what do my peers do? What do my friends do? And this is a period where you pay a lot of attention to that when you're going into puberty. Another vulnerable phase was from the age 18 and 19. You basically finish school and transition into adult life. I remember that also an example from my personal life, like my sister, she's 19 now. She also studies psychology.
Good.
And when she finished school, she would often tell me like, oh, look, like my friend, she got this very competitive placement at like a very prestigious university. Oh, I will never get that. And something, or like someone would have a very fancy apartment. It's like, wow, how did you find that apartment? I will never find a flat on my own. And these are age phases, I think, in which doing rich adolescents are very vulnerable. And I think the third thing is the content, basically, because there's specific content that is indeed or that can be very harmful for adolescents. And so if adolescents are confronted with that content, that is a major risk, I think, for mental health and well-being. I talked earlier about, for example, of sexual abuse or like soliciting and grooming on social media. They could, for example, the adolescents are unwillingly confronted with pornographic content. They are solicited for sending sexual content themselves. That can be very harmful for adolescents. But other things, if we think about mental health conditions, is, for example, if an adolescent is struggling, for example, with eating disorder, for example, we see there are studies that show that, for example, the algorithms of Instagram or other profiles, they have the tendency to keep confronting you, for example, with anorexia-related content, and that can make it very difficult for adolescents to overcome certain challenges. I mean, they also can find support in it. So, for example, if you think about suicidal intentions among adolescents, they can find communities which support them. But this is a very kind of slippery slope. It can be negative, it can be positive. So it depends very much on the individual, on the individual adolescent about whether it's harmful or not. And that is, I think, also that is why it's so important to make parents aware of these effects, because they are best at judging what's best for the adolescents. And we as researchers, we can make some general advice, produce some studies, but it's up to parents to kind of take the input and make decisions in relation to their children.
And what's interesting there is, I think there's a huge pressure on parents because parents don't know. It wasn't there when they were growing up. They don't know how to navigate it. They don't know what to do, what to check. The rules are not there. They haven't seen it modeled themselves, which I think makes it, to me, I come back to the Meta and the Elon Musk and those people who are running these organizations, I believe, have a really big moral responsibility, which they do not take seriously enough.
Yeah, that's something we are currently working on to identify, for example, to put numbers, to put empirical data to this idea, to kind of say, okay, on which platforms does this, for example, this negative content, this abuse-related content, on which platforms does it occur? And then if we have empirical data and can say, okay, look, we see that there are risks on these platforms, then you can formulate a demand to policymakers saying, look, here's the data on that. And now we as a society, I think we should advance policymaking and take these people more into responsibility. And I think that's a fair demand. As soon as we have the data, I think that I'm very confident that we can then make more precise conclusions or demands in that direction.
Absolutely. I think that's amazing. I think it's brilliant that you're doing that because it's desperately needed. And I think, I mean, coming back to what you're saying about that, I've read studies like you were, I think, summarizing in your 3 points, was that it depends what else a child could be doing in that time. So, and for me, one of my core areas of passion is social and emotional learning. And my concern is that we don't have research on this, but when a child is looking at a screen, they're not developing their social and emotional skills in the same way as they would if they were interacting with another human face to face, if they were even outdoor playing, because whilst that's them on their own, they're learning about their own emotional regulation. That really worries me.
Yeah, I think that's indeed an important point. We saw that we saw that a bit during COVID, which is of course an extreme example. But I very much agree that yeah, the alternative, or like the when you're on social media, then doing something else is important to consider. What would that do with their adolescent? Because I think everyone would probably agree that when children play outside together, that is probably better for their emotional, cognitive development than when they are on their own on social media, basically. But of course, there are also individual differences, or different cases to that. For example, imagine a group of adolescents who would kind of meet up online and then play together certain video games that would be on their headphones, communicate together. There could also be there's also a lot to learn there, a lot at stake. So I think that also re-emphasizes what I said earlier, that I think it's up to the parents and the very individual life situation. But I very much agree that it's always the perspective of how can my child grow, or like how can my children, what is best for my children in terms of development, that this is a very good perspective to judge media use by.
And I guess on that sense, it's helping parents, which I know you've done with some of your recommendations, but parents, obviously, they want the best for their kids. Not always. I mean, you'll have seen examples when you've been a social worker when they don't, but in the majority of cases, that's a parent's job, is to want the best for their kids, but we don't always know how to do that. And so the more evidence that you can accumulate and then translate into something that's pragmatic and usable, the better.
Yes, exactly. I would disagree with one point. I think even when working in child protection, I think I most of the time saw parents who would always want the best for the children. But I think in almost any cases, it is a question of knowledge and resources. So yeah, I would. So if, as a researcher, for example, I very much see, well, as an adolescent researcher, I very much see myself, or like the duty of myself to help parents, like to generate that evidence, to help parents, and then to reach out to parents, to go beyond publishing a scientific paper, and reach out to parents, say, look, this is what we found. This is average. This is the evidence. Take it, do with it what you want. We think it could translate in this and that way to everyday life. We don't know for sure, but you make a decision what you think is best for your children. And I think this is very much how, at least I see a substantial aspect of my role as a researcher.
Which again is brilliant, because if I'm looking at it from psychology perspective, my concern is that psychology focuses on developed world in terms of studies, and you're blowing that out of the water, as it were, and disproving that and researching different areas. And the other concern I often have with psychology is we have academia and we have pragmatic, and we're not translating that academia into the pragmatic and the real life. So the fact that you're doing that, whether it's presenting evidence for policy or whether it's actually translating evidence for parents, is something to be celebrated. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, but I think it's also important to point out, or to state, is but I also think not all the responsibility should be brought to parents, because it's a easy position. You say, oh, there's the evidence here, parents, you go do. I think, for example, when it comes to what we talked earlier about, when it comes to content, like to abuse-related online content and stuff, I think that is something we also need to put responsibility on policymakers, on companies. So we can't just say, okay, parents, take care that your children are fine. Here's this social media platform which has any content you could ever think of, and I hope your child doesn't get in the wrong corners of the internet. So this is also but you pointed it out correctly, that educating or reaching out to parents is one point, but then also to demand policy changes and reach out to policymakers. That's the other point, because some things are beyond control, what a parent or what an individual user on a certain platform could control. So this is why we also need action on society levels.
And do you see differences in the willingness to take action across the different countries where you're studying?
I think we are not yet there in that phase of our study. It is very much in the phase of accumulating evidence, and then at a later stage will be possible to make recommendations. And I also think that there's also the risk, or like a similar risk, that I think we don't take. For example, if we do research a lot on like the global south, that we then don't put the burden on rather smaller countries and like smaller governments in these countries, because obviously the US and we as European Union and UK
sadly
we have a lot of leverage in influencing these policies, and I think the arenas to fight in are the European Union, the US, and the United Nations. And it is very much, I think, important that we find a consensus as with different countries, how to address the power of, or how to deal with the power of big multinational corporations like Meta and TikTok and these companies, because like you pointed out earlier, they act very internationally, and so I think it is beyond the control of individual countries to address these challenges in relation to social media.
And do you feel like we will always be slightly a step behind? I mean, sometimes that's, in some ways it's inevitable because you can't research what's not already there, but it does feel like it's getting almost further and further away at the speed at which everything is developing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of the nature of the game. A big company spends years developing a product, then they make the product accessible to the broader public. I mean, a recent good example was ChatGPT. They've been working on it for years, then they put it out, and now slowly, like people are policymakers, researchers, I think, okay, what can we do with it? And in our field with social media, I think we're a couple of years behind in properly regulating these big platforms, but I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it would be better to be quicker, but I would advocate that it's better to do thorough studies, do thorough research, maybe take a bit more of a time, but then come to more substantial, more grounded, more robust conclusions. I'm not an expert on the policy making process, but I would also assume that there's probably better to take a little bit of more time if the end product is better, because if you would introduce a regulation once, I think it would be very difficult to change it afterwards. So probably do something maybe a little bit later, but then do it right. And so I think it's not a bad thing. It can seem quite frustrating. We're always behind, but I don't think it's too bad.
No, it's a very good reasoning there. I hadn't even thought of that actually, about how you can get that regulation incorrect, and then it's very difficult to fine tune or to adjust it once that's been put in place. Good point. Well made. What are you actually working on right now? So you said when we came on that your voice was a little croaky because you did a 2-hour lecture in an air-conditioned lecture hall yesterday. What were you lecturing?
I was just lecturing statistics. It wasn't.
See, I don't think people understand the level of statistics that there is in psychology. So when I did my MSc, part of it was we had to do advanced statistics, and medicine and psychology are the two areas where you have so many different variables that you have to have quite an in-depth understanding of that.
I mean, my approach is a bit more. I didn't lecture like advanced statistics. We have a course where we basically teach robust statistics. You could say, like, the course is called Robust Behavior.
That's a good name. I like that.
Yeah, because so I did a master in statistics and did a lot of statistics during my PhD, and there is super sophisticated stuff, super advanced, and every year more advanced techniques come out. But I think what is the most important thing is that we understand the basics and we do them right.
I think that's so important. It's like you can apply the wrong model to the same data and you get a totally different outcome.
Yes, exactly. One example from my current work, which is related to that, is the study in collaboration with UNICEF I just talked about. So we are interested in getting proper estimates of how often adolescents in different countries encounter abuse-related content online. And so we're basically only, if you want to simplify it a bit, we're basically only occupied with estimating means. And we've been working on that since half a year, because if you really want to properly estimate a mean, there are very many things to keep in mind, like sampling theory, a little about survey statistics, like how can you combine data from different countries? How can you represent a population accurately? And so on this project, we run very simple statistics, more or less, and I'm really happy with that. Well, I think this is a bigger challenge for me as a statistician. Probably the biggest challenge I've had in my young career so far, because if you really want to get it, you never can get it 100% right. But if you really want to get it right or you want to be confident about your results to a very high degree, then doing simple cross tabulations can be very challenging. And so this is what I also try to transport or try to convey to students during lectures. And I think it would be good if we all would come a bit back, move to the roots and focus more on that. But that's also not my individual opinion. There's a big movement in research, and what that also inspired me.
Interesting. I didn't know that. I didn't know there was a big movement. So I'm conscious of your time. You've got amazingly important things to do. So grateful for your hour explaining the research you've done and you're doing. I'm also hugely grateful for the work you're doing, because it is so needed, and it does need to be done properly, not just sort of, I think this is this, or I throw out some numbers here. It's hugely important. So thank you on behalf of all parents of adolescent kids globally. And please keep doing it, because someone needs to be doing it and doing it well.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I think it's also very, you do a very important contribution in making these things visible and discussing these. So I'm very happy to talk about it.
Thanks so much, Sebastian. to my guest. Thanks to you for listening. If you want to find out more about me and my work, go to fionamerden.com, or my social media handle is also Fiona Merden. If you enjoyed this, please do subscribe, review and tell your friends. It'd be a massive help. But for now, goodbye, and I hope you have a great week.